Okay, I think we'll get started. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss crisis communications, Indian and Pakistani perspectives on responsible practices. This is a recently published compendium of essays jointly produced by the Centre for Security, Strategy and Policy Research at the University of Lahore, the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, BASIC, and the Institute for Conflict, Cooperation and Security at the University of Birmingham. And it's a piece we're really excited about and really glad you could join us to discuss. So my name is Alice Spillman. I am a policy fellow at BASIC, working on the programme on nuclear responsibilities, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. So to start the discussion, we are first going to hear from three of the editors of the compendium. Firstly, we have Dr. Chiara Chavasio, Policy Fellow and Programme Manager at BASIC. We have Dr. Rabia Akhtar, Director at CSSPR, and Ruhi Nyog, whose camera is going to be off for the moment because she's travelling, but is Director of the IPCS. So their full bios have just been posted in the chat by our lovely programme intern, Mary. So you can read those if you like at your own discretion. So we're then going to have two incredible discussants who will provide a short review of the compendium essays. They will be Ambassador Raghavan, who is a member of the IPCS Governing Council and former Indian High Commissioner to Pakistan and Singapore. And we will then hear from Dr. Adil Sultan, Dean at the Faculty of Aerospace and Strategic Studies and Acting Chair at the Department of Strategic Studies at the Air University, Islamabad. So we'll then move into I will first introduce the compendium authors, and we'll move into a roundtable discussion where the authors will take your questions. I will introduce the authors when we get to that point, and also then I'll outline how we'd like you to ask questions to the authors as well. So for now, I will pass over to Chiara for some introductory remarks.
Many thanks, Alice. Let me just start by just welcoming you all participants and panelists to this webinar. And thank you on behalf of BASIC and the ICCS for joining us today. I also would like to thank Dr. Rabia Akhtar and CISP and Ruhi Nyog and the IPCS for the invaluable partnership that we have with institutional partnership that we have, and the work that we've been doing over the past few years on the nuclear responsibilities program is pretty much a joint effort, and this is really invaluable. I would also like to thank the editorial team of the compendium and all the authors for your insightful contributions. Thank you to the discussants, Ambassador Dr. Raghavan and Dr. Adil Sultan. Thanks to the IPCS team in helping us running this event, and special thanks to Mari McClafty at BASIC for really invaluable support in setting up our work on the compendium and on this webinar. So I thought that in my introductory remarks, what I could do is to really share with all of you, why did we choose India-Pakistan crisis communication as a topic for this compendium? And why did we choose to explore this topic through the lens of responsible practices? So the journey of this compendium really started a while ago, 2 years ago, in one of our nuclear responsibilities dialogue. So what is the Nuclear Responsibilities Dialogue? We have a flagship program, the Nuclear Responsibilities Program, and a flagship nuclear responsibilities approach, which is aimed at reframing how we think, talk, and write about nuclear weapons, putting meaningful exploration of nuclear responsibilities really at the center of the debate. So instead of blaming others for being irresponsible, we encourage exploration of what it means to have nuclear responsibilities. And we focus during the dialogues, we focus on the conversations on both sort of internal exploration of our own responsibilities, our state's responsibilities, but also collectively think about shared responsibilities that states might have in the international system. So we held one of our dialogues was focused on the Asia Pacific and on shared responsibilities in the Asia Pacific. And the area of communication during India-Pakistan crisis was flagged as a crucial area where both sides have shared a responsibility, not just to prevent crises from happening, but also to make sure that crises do not escalate to the nuclear level. So this was identified as a shared responsibility. We then held a follow-up dialogue where we gathered Pakistani and Indian nuclear policy experts and journalists together to discuss what a responsibility-based approach can add to our understanding of our crises are prevented, managed, and de-escalated in the India-Pakistan context. So in other words, we explored what are the responsibilities of different sectors of society, such as the government, the military, the media, the civil society, before and during a crisis, and which of those responsibilities are shared. So the compendium is pretty much a result of this dialogue, and authors have elaborated on these questions. And I would like to conclude my remarks by saying that this work is really not an end point, in my view. It is a starting point for a self-reflecting journey that BASIC and the IPCS will continue to facilitate for all nuclear armed states, really. So starting from this reflection on India and Pakistan, we would like also to extend the conversation on nuclear responsibilities and responsible practices to all nuclear armed states, to explore the responsibilities that they bear from the possession of nuclear weapons, responsibilities that they bear to each other and to the rest of the world. Nuclear policy, if you think about it, it's very much about communication. It's very much about signaling. And therefore, nuclear armed states bear special responsibilities in relation to how do they communicate with each other in a way that can make them secure without triggering spirals of insecurity that can lead to major crises and even war. So I really hope that you will enjoy the conversation today. And I would like to thank you again for attending this event. And I'm happy to pass the floor to my colleague, Dr. Rabia Akhtar.
Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to congratulate all the authors of this brilliant compendium on crisis communications, India and Pakistani perspectives on responsible practices. It was an absolute pleasure to co-edit it with Dr. Chiara, Ruhi Nyuk, Alice Spillman, and Nicholas Wheeler. And it has been such a pleasure being a part of this project on nuclear responsibilities and looking at India and Pakistan crisis communication dynamics through that lens. It has been a great learning experience for me. The importance of this work presented in this compendium, it cannot be understated, especially considering the long-standing tensions between India and Pakistan, two neighboring countries that possess nuclear weapons. So if you have not read the compendium yet, and you're still attending this workshop and will be watching the video later, I would urge everybody to please read the compendium and leave your feedback for us. The potential, we believe, for a nuclear crisis to escalate into a catastrophic event is a very, very real concern for the international community. And effective communication and confidence building measures are essential for mitigating these risks. I believe that the contribution of Pakistani and Indian nuclear policy experts and journalists in this collection of essays is paramount, as it offers a unique perspective on the region's political complexities and the challenges of crisis management. Moreover, these findings from the compendium highlight the importance of cross-border dialogue and cooperation, which have been sporadic in recent years due to political and ideological differences. I would like to note that this compendium has emerged from a BASIC-ICCS nuclear responsibilities dialogue that was held in Bangkok in December 2022. And BASIC-ICCS framework, as Dr. Chiara has also pointed out, recognizes that states' responsibilities, they extend beyond the security to disarmament, non-proliferation, and peaceful uses of nuclear energy. The dialogue brought together both Indian and Pakistani nuclear policy experts and journalists who jointly explored as to how governments and media can shoulder this responsibility, especially in crisis situations. The recommendations by the Compendium's authors for strengthening crisis communication and confidence-building measures during India-Pakistan interactions provide an insightful analysis for proactive measures that can be taken to prevent escalation and rapid de-escalation if a crisis does occur. So this analysis is of significant academic importance as it is grounded in the theory of crisis management, which could be relevant to conflict-prone areas around the world beyond our region. And I believe that overall, the findings and recommendations from this compendium serve as an exemplary model for building greater trust and promoting a shared sense of responsibility between two neighboring nuclear armed nations. And I believe that it is undoubtedly a crucial step towards de-escalating tensions, fostering peace and stability in South Asia, and enhancing global nuclear security. And especially in the light of ongoing tensions between India and Pakistan, the focus of this compendium is to explore how adversarial relationships can communicate with one another in ways that will prevent crisis from occurring, and if they do occur, ensure that they are de-escalated as swiftly as possible. By analyzing nuclear responsibilities for both countries, the papers collected in this compendium, they offer new insights into the implications of distrust-driven dynamics that exist between India and Pakistan. We all agree that there is a need for effective communication between India and Pakistan, which is paramount in preventing and de-escalating crises. Therefore, by reducing mutual distrust and improving communication mechanisms, the two nations can achieve timely and accurate signaling, thereby preventing crisis from escalating and reducing the risk of catastrophic consequences. As one of the editors of this compendium, I welcome all the participants and audience to this webinar, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A and comments from the audience to think out of the box and take this conversation forward. Over to you, Dr. Chiara. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dr. Rabia. And I will now pass the floor to Ruhi Nauk.
Thank you, Chiara. Very quickly, since I feel like I'm going to echo a lot of what's already been said. I'll begin by thanking Ambassador Dr. Raghavan, Dr. Sultan, the audience, of course, our authors and panelists, Ejaz, Nirupama, Dr. Malik and Kamal, and a special shout out, of course, to the BASIC-ICCS, CSSPR, and IPCS team. Thank you very much. My apologies. I muted myself, I think. Right. So as I was saying, I expect to echo a lot of what's already been said. But just to supplement the conversation, you know, this compendium, as both Chiara and Rabia have mentioned, is a result of an India-Pakistan dialogue, but it's also part of our broader collaboration.
Ruhi, I'm afraid you're muted again.
Did you lose me again?
Yes, I'm afraid so.
Could you tell me where you lost me?
You hadn't got very far, just saying that it had come out of it.
Apologies.
Bilateral. Yeah.
So, right. So as Chiara also mentioned, you know, the themes of perception and communication sort of emerged as very high priority issues in the earliest meetings that we had held. And the meeting that we had held in Ajmer also earlier this year, which was a closed door roundtable, a lot of the discussions that we facilitated over 2021 sort of fed into that agenda. And I think through this process, what we quickly realized was that often these sorts of discussions between India and Pakistan boil down to one tool, which is hotlines. And our endeavor through the course of this project has been to expand the framework to communications more generally speaking. And I do feel that this has sort of afforded us greater insight into the several other tools of engagement that exist between our two countries. And some of these could be direct, some of these could be indirect, some probably more prone to disruption than others. In a lot of these essays, whether it is on CBMs and hotlines, on media narratives, on the utility of track 1.5 and track 2 dialogues, whether it is the value of uninterrupted scholarship, regardless of the state of India-Pakistan relations, we see a lot of these themes reflected. And I think this is particularly useful because during crises, these tools and their potential disruption between India and Pakistan could both enable or they could also disable policy and decision-making maneuverability. A final quick note before you lose me again, because I'm not sure, I feel like I'm going in and out. So Rabia and I have co-authored the conclusion to take a look at like this particular act of an Indian scholar and a Pakistani scholar writing together, even though Rabia and I have known each other for a long time. That itself was a very interesting process of intellectual negotiation for us. And I think in a large way, in a very sort of explicit way, it reflects what we're trying to achieve with this particular project, which is not just the outcome, but also the process of communication itself and what that could contribute to in terms of, crisis, whether it's de-escalation or management, et cetera, between India and Pakistan. What I'll do is I'll end here for now, but I'd be happy to jump back in if there are questions posed to me. And of course, I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Thanks again, and back to you, guys.
Thank you so much to all of you, Chiara, Rabia and Ruhi, for both highlighting where the compendium came from and the discussions that we had, and also the importance of the compendium and further conversations and research on the topic of crisis communications. And I think some of the really interesting things you highlighted there was that one of the things we're really proud of with this compendium is we did talk about communication more broadly, and we engaged journalists in our debates, which was really interesting. And we are incredibly proud of our conclusion from both you, Rabia and Ruhi. Thank you so much for doing that together, because as you say, it's a really unique piece to have a co-authored piece by an Indian scholar and a Pakistani scholar on the topic. So thank you. We now move on to comments on the essays in review from two wonderful speakers. We have firstly Ambassador Raghavan, who will be commenting first on the essays, and then we'll have Dr. Sultan as well commenting. I really look forward to your comments. I should obviously introduce your bios too. Sorry, these will be posted in the chat by Mary. So Ambassador Raghavan is a member of the IPCS Governing Council, former Indian High Commissioner to Pakistan and Singapore, and Dr. Adil, who I've introduced both of them already, but Dean at the Faculty of Aerospace and Strategic Studies and Acting Chair, Department of Strategic Studies at Air University, Islamabad. So over to you, Ambassador, first for your comments.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, and I've benefited from reading the compendium and each of the articles in it. I realize there are a number of speakers, so I'll try to be as brief as possible and not repeat the points already made. That clearly there is a felt need for having good communication systems, given Pakistan and India's long history of adversarial relations and history of conflict, etc. So I won't go into all that, but let me begin by saying that all the elements in the cocktail which lead to this concern about lack of effective communication mechanisms have been well identified in this compendium. There is a great extent of strategic mistrust, strategic suspicion. There are toxic media narratives, and there is often a realistic understanding of each other's position and of the other country. So this point is certainly well taken, and I think each of the essays in the compendium have brought that out very clearly. What also comes out very clearly is how strong how influential pre-existing narratives are in both countries. And to my mind, the general phenomena which it suggests is a very strong degree of what is generally termed strategic narcissism and not enough strategic empathy. I think this is a characteristic of India's perceptions of Pakistan, and similarly Pakistan's perceptions of India. Consequently, the strategic community in both countries tends to ignore contrarian evidence, even when it stares it in the face. So in India, the view has consolidated over the years and remains very strong that given the power of the Pakistan military in public affairs, it is unrealistic to expect any major improvement in the overall texture of the relationship. In Pakistan, similarly, the sense which has crystallized is that as long as there is a quote-unquote Hindu nationalist government in India, there will not be any forward movement. I think this really, both these views ignore contrarian evidence, and there is a great deal of contrarian evidence. I won't go into that because that is generally well known. But for instance, it overlooks the fact that major advances in India-Pakistan relations have very frequently taken place when the Pakistan military has been in a dominant position and not otherwise. And similarly, in the case of India, the Pakistani view ignores the significant steps which were taken in 2015 and 2016 by the same Hindu nationalist government. So I think the power of pre-existing narratives is so strong that contrarian evidence is often ignored, and that adds to this overall sense of strategic mistrust and strategic suspicion. Now, the compendium has made a number of suggestions, and I generally think these are sound suggestions. The development of more rigorous scholarship about the other country, freer visas for journalists, extending the pre-notification regime to cruise missiles, encouraging cross-border intellectual projects, etc. These are all excellent ideas and have been tried from time to time. I remember in the first decade of this century, there was something called the South Asia Free Media Initiative. It gathered a fair amount of traction addressing the toxic narratives, media narratives, which had been very prevalent in the late 90s and early 2000s. Similarly, the idea of encouraging scholarship about the other country, a major initiative was that of the SARC University, which also ran into heavy weather. There was also an expansion of CVMs between 2004 and 2008, specifically directing themselves to the larger strategic community on both sides. So this wider initiatives have been taken, but there are difficulties attendant to each of these. When we look at scholarship, in India, I find, and I'm sure the same applies to Pakistan, it is very difficult to develop genuine scholarship in India about Pakistan when scholars realize that they will not be able to travel to the other country to get a first-hand view of it. So for a young scholar embarking on a PhD, it makes that much more sense to think of some other particular region to study or some other particular country to study rather than focus on Pakistan, because the inability to travel places question marks on the scholarship ab initio, which can never really be overcome. So I think the difficulties which are there are quite significant, and this is one point which I wish to make. The second point is, I think the DGMO's hotline is a valuable mechanism, and it has often proved its utility. But we tend to overlook that the mechanism, because of its nature, is firstly more focused on the more focused on the army of both sides, and in particular is more LOC focused. I think hotlines have a certain utility in crisis situations, and there is possibly a need to think of expanding hotlines to for there to be an Air Force to Air Force hotline, a Navy to Navy hotline. In the past, there was a hotline between the respective Coast Guards, and also it did work to some extent, and perhaps it has fallen into disuse. But I do think hotlines in crisis situations can be useful. It's not to say that they will always be useful. We need other mechanisms also, and also action on a broad front of the kind which has been outlined in this compendium. But nevertheless, more hotlines is not a bad idea. It's a good idea. The larger point, of course, is that there is no easy solution to India-Pakistan issues, and the hard grind of diplomacy, remains the most effective communication system which is available. Now, diplomacy includes public diplomacy, and it need not just be public diplomacy by the respective foreign offices, but certainly diplomacy and the role of governments remain key. My final point is that while there are many takeaways from the India-Pakistan interface, and there is a great deal of scope for what can be attempted, it's also good to think about some positives, because too often the India-Pakistan context is seen entirely in a negative perspective. For instance, till 2 years ago, if asked to judge the India-Pakistan interface in terms of crisis management, I would have probably also said the mark awarded should be a C, perhaps even a C minus. But if we look at what is happening in Europe today and the breakdown of relations between Russia and Ukraine, or between Russia and NATO, it is a good example of how badly neighborhood relations can turn out unless they are managed properly. So in the Russia-Ukraine context, or in the context of what is happening in Europe today, I would say I would give India and Pakistan possibly even a B, if not a B plus. I think the important point is not to be complacent in the India-Pakistan context, and certainly look ahead positively, but also draw lessons from what is happening around in the world. The Russia-Ukraine situation is a classic example of how bad neighborhood relations can get. And it is also a standing example for India and Pakistan that this is one path you do not want to go down on. I'll close with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and thank you for ending on a slightly positive note and reminding us to look at what has worked well in the past as well as what could be improved. Thank you. Dr. Adil Sultan, over to you for your remarks.
Thank you very much. Thanks to BASIC, and thanks to all the partners who made it possible on this interesting compendium. And I believe, Alice, you have control, so if I run over my allotted time, so you will mute me and inform me over there. Okay. The two things that something was said about intellectual negotiations by Ruhi. I think that's a very interesting term. And this book, or the chapters authored by different scholars from Pakistan and India, I think that's one example of intellectual negotiations. I'm going to use this term quite frequently for the future also. So thank you, Ruhi, also. Yesterday was while I was thinking about this event, and just to make remarks, an incident happened in Pakistan where a chairlift got stuck, and there were 8 students and the teacher. They were stuck in that about almost 1,000 feet up in the air. And somebody like all the media, and I will talk about the media's role also. The media built up that hype, and they were talking about what could be possibly done. And all sorts of experts were there on the media. But some people made a remark that if Pakistan had Chinook helicopter, probably this would have been easier to rescue these young souls from there. So I was just thinking, if India and Pakistan would have been talking to each other, and for this such kind of humanitarian crisis, and if they can just pick up a telephone and request that you have a Chinook helicopter, and here the 8 souls are hanging up in the air, we need to save lives. I think that's the kind of thing that we can be adversaries. We can continue to maintain our respective position on whatever differences we have. But if we develop our understanding and go beyond our traditional position, that once it comes to humanitarian issues, and we should talk, and this all can also be reflected in terms of when we talk about nuclear dangers. But this was one example where somebody could have taken a lead, even from a Pakistani side or from an Indian side, and this could have been a positive gesture, because even if we are adversaries in times of crisis, we can help each other. So I think as humans, we should think on these issues. So there are 3 questions that I was thinking: why India and Pakistan are reluctant to communicate with each other. So the problem is that the strategic culture, some of the authors have highlighted that. And do we understand each other's strategic culture? Kamal mentioned that, yes, we do understand. And I think our conclusion is that we do understand. That is why we behave the way we behave with each other. The second could be the domestic politics on both sides. In the past, Pakistan polity had been using India card, but for the past many years, we don't see India card in domestic politics in Pakistan, but this tendency has grown onto the Indian side, where Pakistan card is used for domestic politics. So that create divisions also, and one of the authors has also highlighted in their paper. The third could be institutional disconnect or dissonance, whether the institutions that are responsible, they're talking, or there is a good communication between political leadership and the institutions that are responsible, or there is a dissonance amongst them. So that could be. And fourth could be that we tend to emulate everything from the Cold War model. So not everything is applicable. What United States or Soviet Union or United States or Russia was doing, that may not necessarily be applicable for Pakistan and India. So we need to tailor our strategies or whatever we think about, and we need to make it more relevant to our region. The second question was, if they are communicating, then why it is not effective? Ambassador Saab mentioned something about, I think I agree, image fixation of each other, that we have certain predispositions and we want to see each other from a particular lens, whether we are from the academia, from the military, or from the political side. So that image fixation over a period of time, that has ingrained into our strategic culture, and we are reluctant to see otherwise. Third question was, what needs to be done for the future? And I think this compendium and this booklet would be important for future, to start this intellectual negotiations, at least, that we need to, notwithstanding differences, we need to talk to each other. So I'll just briefly highlight some of the points that were made by the authors, and I'll give my perspective on those issues, and I'll try not to be repetitive, but there are some issues that will come again and again. For example, DGMO's hotline and things like that. Ijaz Haider, I think he made very cogent point about the Pulwama crisis and the Balakot crisis and the cruise missile incident. So he is right once he said both sides are reluctant to talk to each other when it is needed most. So we have these hotlines, the one hotline which is active, the other hotline that was established after 2004, Lahore process, MOU, the composite dialogue process between the foreign secretaries. I don't think so it has ever worked. And during cruise missile incident, if somebody had used that, probably the crisis would not have been, or at least the media, the crisis that was triggered and the media then picked up, it could have been subdued. So whatever arrangements we have already between two of us, and they were established after considerable thought process on both sides. I think these need to be emphasized and used during crisis. Ijaz also talked about this triangular approach. I think this is a more recent phenomena where whenever we read from the Indian side, the literature coming out, they talk about that they cannot talk to Pakistan unless China is brought in too. That means you are making it complex. You're not trying to establish bilateral links and you want to bring in China. And we all understand, I think we don't have to go into basics. China is never going to engage in a bilateral controversy between India and Pakistan. So that means we are not going to do anything. Because these concepts of strategic chain, that unless United States does something, then China will do something, then India would do something, and Pakistan would do something. I think these studies are hypothetical, good for literature, but these are far from reality. We should stick to reality that India and Pakistan are both nuclear weapon states, and what we need to do is find solutions to lessen dangers in South Asia, and we don't need to redefine South Asia as Southern Asia or something else, because if we expand that definition, then we are making the problem more complex, and we are drifting away from our primary goal, how to reduce dangers between two countries. Ijaz also is right once he says there's no space for new CBMs on crisis communication. Yes, that is because of domestic politics, as I already mentioned, but this is also because of the third party's role in India and Pakistan. And there are more than one actors. They are who have interest in this region, and that makes it complicated for establishing. In the past, yes, third parties or party, whatever you want to infer, had facilitated these kind of dialogues between India and Pakistan, but I think the environment has changed. Probably it's not in the interest of those powers to have this region peaceful, but as South Asians, we have to see what is best in our interest. And now coming to Nirupuma's commentary, or I think very excellent, and I was very intrigued by her suggestion that we can revise or we can review that Nehru-Liaquat Pact of 1950 to develop a joint press code, because she was talking mostly about media's role and how we can establish communication link in this age of hyper media. Yeah, that's interesting, but that was to avoid communal unrest. So that could have been possible maybe 50 years ago. In this age, when everybody is a media channel by himself or herself, regulating media has become a very, very difficult task. And we don't know what happens in the coming years, the way media is evolving. So it makes very challenging to have the interstate agreement that we would try to regulate media, not to create controversies, not to deepen distrust, but you cannot control more than 1 billion people on both sides living the way these things Twitter takes on, or the social media. And we also saw this during Pulwama crisis, the Balakot crisis, and even the cruise missile incident, how individuals or groups, they took upon themselves to defend their respective national positions, and they came up with stories which were distant from the reality. So that's a big challenge that we have to see. The third chapter from Salma Malik, she brought out very interesting proposals. And I'm just going to comment briefly on their viability or not. So it's not a critique kind of a thing, but I think it gives an interesting point to start thinking on these issues. She talked about this bilateral regional security summit, regional nuclear security summit. Having worked on the policy side previously and having dealt with the Indian counterparts at the Obama-led Nuclear Security Summit, I think we all understand that nuclear security is a very, very sensitive issue. States are very reluctant, and once it comes to India and Pakistan, it would be something of a no-go kind of area. And during the Obama-led Nuclear Security Summit, there were more than 50 heads of states involved. So there was a momentum led by the superpowers. So many countries reluctantly, even if they didn't agree, they joined. But if you bring something of similar sort between India and Pakistan, I don't think so. This is going to lead anywhere. But it's a good thought process, academic. We can think about it. The second proposal is, again, a nuclear risk reduction centers between the two countries. So it's being discussed on many levels amongst the academia for the past many years. I've heard about these proposals. Again, something that I said in the beginning, that what worked between Russia and United States or Soviet Union and United States is not necessarily is going to work between India and Pakistan. Then several variables, and I'm not going to go into those debates, but once we are talking about nuclear risk reduction centers, so we have to have two compatible bodies, those who would be communicating with each other. And secondly, from a Pakistani perspective, we don't see nuclear and conventional capability as two separate. It's part of overall military capability, and that's because of their the kind of threat that Pakistan perceives that it has. Its nuclear capability is there to counter India's conventional superiority also. So you cannot dehyphenate conventional and nuclear from a Pakistani perspective. So once you want to build those centers, there would be issues who would man those. From the Indian side, there could be different institutions. So from Pakistani side, we know a military has a dominating role, so that could be problematic. Third was adding cruise missile notification. Yeah, I understand Rabia has also advocated for this. Many other scholars are saying, yes, it is good for optics, but once we look at the ballistic missile notification, the intent behind that proposal was that if the adversary is able to detect, because of the parabola that the ballistic missiles, the adversary should not perceive it as a kind of a preemptive strike. Hence, we should have this notification, pre-notification agreement where the party that is launching a ballistic missile for test, they should notify. So in terms of cruise, radars are not going to detect. It is just going to add another responsibility. It can be a cosmetic steps, but it is not going to add anything tangible in terms of reducing dangers. The final point by Salma Malik was the responsible communication on non-use of nuclear weapons and reinforcing the nuclear taboo. It is the way we see the nuclear use, because nuclear, once we talk about nuclear use, it is not actual physical use of nuclear capability. Having that deterrent is good enough. You can say that both sides are using nuclear capability to deter each other, so that's a nuclear use. But if you start to make it a taboo, I think that is something that would make it difficult to convince the policymakers. Can they do that, especially once you want your nuclear capability to deter or balance out the adversary's conventional superiority. So again, the point of dehyphenation, can we do that or not? Kamal's point, I think I agree what he said. Both have the responsibilities to read the other side. Probably they do understand each other, and also the external actors. So I just made a comment. Yes, I think they do understand. And that is why they behave the way they behave with each other. Now, another thing that about should we have these kind of research or conversation on crisis management? I think, yes, there's no doubt about it. There's always value in this intellectual negotiations that we must continue to do, but this should be close to reality, not based on hypothetical scenarios. Yes, as academics, we work on so many hypotheses, and we should continue to think about it. But once we are working as having some experience of each other, I think we can bring more reality into it. One point about the communication in the shadow of nuclear weapons. It is very important to have that communication with clarity. But the important thing is who is communicating. Because if everybody starts to speak, I'm talking about the leadership, those who are responsible. And we have seen on both the sides, some of the politicians who had no business with nuclear capability and little understanding of how nuclear deterrence work, they had been issuing statements, and that had led to controversies or miscommunication on both sides. And that is one important issue that both sides need to identify what would be the channels to communicate, especially during crisis. Finally, on role of media, I have said already enough, and I have used borrowed this term from somewhere else, this thermonuclear Twitter, and Arabia also spoke at our university on this. The leaders, they are communicating with each other through Twitters. We saw Trump, and we see many other leaders also. So during crisis, if the leadership, they start to hurl nuclear threats against each other on Twitter, so it becomes very, very problematic to regulate that media or control that kind of conversation. So I think I would stop here. Alice, before you tell me to close my mic. So I'll be open to any questions or observations or remarks by anyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sultan. And thank you to both of you, to the Ambassador and Dr. Sultan, for those excellent comments. I think you both made the point that reducing risks, you made many points, but the point that reducing risks between India and Pakistan is not about reinventing the wheel and developing new CBMs, and that the domestic environment right now maybe doesn't allow for that. But what we can do is think about how we tackle the reasons why existing mechanisms are not always effective. And Dr. Sultan, you gave some really interesting suggestions as to why they're not used and then why they're not always effective. And I found particularly interesting the points around a lack of strategic empathy and the fixed images of one another that you both talked about. And I'm thinking a lot now about how we can begin to overcome or at least mitigate some of these challenges. And I do think that I'll also adopt the language of intellectual negotiations. And so I agree with you, Dr. Sultan, that it's a really good place to start to continue these conversations on communications and engage in realistic intellectual debates with one another. So I think you've both set us up really well for what follows, which is a roundtable discussion between the essay authors. So hopefully they will join us on screen in just a second, and I will introduce them to you. Firstly, we have Ijaz Haider, former news editor at the Friday Times and former executive editor at the Daily Times. And we have Nirupama Subramanian, a highly renowned senior journalist. I've been spotlighted again. A highly renowned senior journalist, previously resident editor and national affairs editor at the Indian Express. And then we welcome two very smart academics as well, Dr. Salma Malik, Associate Professor at the Department of Defence and Strategic Studies, and Kamal Madashetty, Senior Researcher at IPCS. And so hopefully you can see everyone on screen at the moment. We're going to start with each author is going to be invited to speak for a maximum of 5 minutes. So I will be timing you and I will interrupt you if needed. I'm sorry. And to briefly share remarks about their contributions to the compendium. And then we will be taking audience questions. I know some of you have already started using the Q&A function, which is amazing. So to ask questions, we do ask that you use the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Please type your questions into the function. And if your question is directed to a particular author, please also specify who it's directed to. And just so you're aware, we may group the questions if we get lots around a particular theme, but I will ask them once each of the speakers have gone through their 5 minutes of remarks. So it's over to the authors now. Ijaz, you'll be first to take the floor, so it's over to you.
Hi, thanks. Sorry, I joined later. I was grappling with technology, and as a matter of fact, Rabia was actually helping me what to do. So we finally managed to, log on. Thank you. Dr. Azam Sultan basically has covered everything. I mean, essentially, the authors now don't really need to say anything about what they've written. But very quickly, there's, of course, it's a no-brainer to say that there should be normalization between India and Pakistan in an overall sense, not just in a particular sense, notwithstanding the fact that it's obviously crucial for a number of reasons that there should be specific measures taken with respect to communication also, and with respect to nuclear risk reduction measures also. So that's, of course, a no-brainer. But the interesting thing is that sometimes one has to see whether the wish assumptions are or wish postulates, if you will, whether you formulate them in a way which is rigorously logical in working out their implications. So that's the important part. So the wish that we need to normalize, and the is of why that's not happening. If we're going to mix up our wishes and is, then we will basically be practicing magic rather than trying to figure out why things are where they are. And to that extent, couple of things. Of course, India and Pakistan both are nuclear weapon states. They are outside the NPT. Their civilian nuclear programs are under the safeguard of IAEA. India is also part of the, it had a 1-2-3 agreement, so it's part of a civil nuclear deal with the United States. It also aspires to be part of the nuclear suppliers group. It's already part of the MTCR. Pakistan has consistently been talking about an approach which is, of course, consistent and non-discriminatory. It's both to non-proliferation and disarmament. It has supported efforts on the CTBT, FMCT, but at the same time argued for a standardized approach to these multilateral arrangements at the CD. Pakistan in recent years has also been advocating the requirement of regulating the emergence of new technologies, which obviously include hypersonic missiles, which is one of the things that I mentioned in my article with reference to already very short distances. And if you add to that, the AI into the kill chain of a hypersonic missile, then we're virtually talking about, perhaps based on where the missile has been launched from, we're basically talking about seconds, perhaps, not even minutes. So, and of course, the LAWs, which is the lethal autonomous weapons, we're talking about cybersecurity here. There is already a lot of literature emerging over the past some years with reference to cyber attacks and nuclear security. Then, of course, the military uses of artificial intelligence and quantum computing. So there are a number of things that are already there, and a number of things that are emerging for which we really do not have regulatory mechanisms so far. So that adds to the instability here. Now, then, of course, in addition to individual responsibilities, a common ground for implementing shared nuclear responsibilities in the bilateral context has so far been elusive. That's one of the basic arguments that I make in my article. And then there are two sets of problems in finding this common ground. One is, of course, as I earlier mentioned, and it's been mentioned before also, Dr. Adil Najam also, Dr. Adil Sultan also mentioned this, the nature of relations between India and Pakistan. Then, of course, India's perception of itself as a regional power that must find a place at the high table. Now, the second is also linked to India's perception of China, with which it has had tense relations since June 2020, but it needs mention and perhaps a bit of stress that it is a matter of empirical record that even after the June 2020 crisis in Ladakh and subsequent attempts by India to beef up its true presence at line of actual control, its primary order of battle remains West-centric and against Pakistan. Then, if I may, invoke track 1.5 dialogue, which BASIC and ICCS did back in 2022, and the report is also available. This included the ASEAN countries, Australia, India, and Pakistan. And that report flags the fact there are different perceptions of nuclear responsibilities among different states. For instance, India distinguishes and therefore differentiates between the responsibilities it owes to self and to others. Indian dialogue participants, according to the report, also cited India's nuclear doctrine as the source of their responsibilities to others. And this is, as per India, the document that mitigates the tension between the two sets of responsibilities. From our perspective, frankly, this is a problematic position because there is a lot of evidence, and I mentioned that in my article, that India has come a long way since the 2003 doctrine and is no longer actually wedded to a no first use policy in any operational sense. In any case, there is a lot of literature with reference to NFU, which is that it's basically a political declaration. And, you know, the Warsaw Pact talked about NFU, and, you know, when the wall came down and when the secret documents, you know, were looked at by the West German government, they realized that the operational plan of the Warsaw Pact were about first and early use of nuclear weapons, even in case of a conventional conflict. So it doesn't have any operational value per se. Now for Pakistan, and again, this was what came out at the BASIC-ICCS report, the most important responsibility is to ensure continued deterrence against India, and that requires eradicating the causes of conflict and ensuring peace by preventing India from undertaking a military adventure. Now, this is very important because of India's limited war perspective or doctrine, if you will, which they have been testing also, although they still don't really have the capacity, but there is the sense that there is a small band in which they can take punitive action against Pakistan. And my argument in the article is that this is necessarily a destabilizing approach. So essentially, Pakistan's idea is it situates nuclear responsibilities in a broader bi- and multilateral context, and that kind of underscores the imperative, if you will, of addressing the causes of potential conflict between India and Pakistan. So it's kind of a broader you know, idea. And Pakistan, on a number of occasions, also suggested many nuclear risk reduction measures. Dr. Adil Sultan is well aware of that. He's also mentioned those and some of those. So from Pakistan, and many of those India has kind of dismissed because of this triangular thing with China. So China is kind of, instead of this being a nuclear dyad, India's kind of position, at least in terms of not engaging Pakistan on certain issues, is you know, something that brings China into this triad. So it becomes a triad rather than a nuclear dyad. So
Ijaz, I'm afraid
so Pakistan,
you're at time. I'm afraid. Are you
sorry.
okay just to quickly wrap up, and then we can pick some of this up in the Q&A as well?
Okay, sure. So anyway, so let me then, you know, sort of talk about a positive thing. So something that has not happened even in older nuclear weapon states. So this is about the agreement on prohibition of attacks against nuclear installations and facilities between Pakistan and India, and it was signed on 31st December 1988 and ratified on 27th Jan 1991. And as agreements go, this one has actually stuck. I mean, both countries inform each other of their nuclear installations and facilities, falling within its definition. And this list is exchanged on 1st Jan of every calendar year. It's actually held. So I think if you were looking for a positive note, I just gave you one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ijaz, and thank you for ending on a positive note. I will pass straight over to Nirupama. Oh, I'm sorry, you're still on mute.
Thank you so much. And thank you, BASIC, also for asking me to write the piece. It was quite a process, and I can't say I enjoyed it all the time, but I like that, you know, you all the editors made me do more research and bring more rigor to the piece. So I'm thankful that it turned out the way it has, and thanks to you all for that. You know, I won't repeat what is already in the piece because most of you would have read it. I think I'll just sum up the main takeaway from that. I mean, what I was trying to say basically in that piece is that in order for media to play its proper role in India-Pakistan relations, what is a proper role for media is always debated, but some call it peace journalism, some would call it constructive journalism, some would call it responsible journalism. But the media has, I think the essential role of media is truth-telling. And, when we say something is objective journalism, objective is not, just getting both sides to quotes from both sides and to try and balance, what you're saying, but it's a process really. And for that process, the coverage of something or anything has to be consistent. It has to be almost, if I may use the word, routinized. It has to be almost daily. It has to and it has to be, it has to have that rigor of almost a daily routine. And this, if I may say so, is possible only when you have people following the India-Pakistan story in the India-Pakistan context. If you have correspondents on both sides who are covering the country day after day after day after day, as Indian journalists used to do at one point of time. There were many in the 90s, and then it just came down to 2 by the time I got there, and now it's, of course, none. So this is what I'm. This is my main the main point that I was trying to make in that piece, that it has to become a routinized, consistent coverage, and this is also important because it then it kind of normalizes the two countries. If you talk about normalizing the relationship between India and Pakistan, then it also normalizes the two countries as two functioning countries with their own sets of problems, with their pluses and minuses, their achievements. For instance, Dr. Sultan just mentioned the rescue operation yesterday. In another world, Indian newspapers would have covered it nicely, would have covered it a good spread, because this is something that's happened in a neighboring country. It's dramatic, it's got tension, it's got rescue, it's got kids, it's got, people screaming for their lives, the wind's blowing and all that. I didn't see one story on page 1. I read 3 or 4 papers in the morning. I had to look through, I didn't even know it had happened, and I just chanced upon it on an inside page. So this is what I mean when I say, you have to normalize it instead of just covering the crisis. I mean, if you contrast this with the amount of attention that has been given to the imminent coming apart of the Pakistan army, by the Indian media in May and June and July, you'd understand what I'm trying to say. Sometimes I feel sometimes Indian media covers Pakistan, crisis in Pakistan, to divert attention from our own crisis. For instance, Indian media has stopped covering the Kashmir story, and till a few weeks ago, we were not even paying that much attention to Manipur. After the first few days, it moved off the page 1. After from the front pages of newspapers, television wasn't even, didn't even think it important enough to cover it. But so that is how it is. So my thing of saying, that you have to have boots on the ground on both sides, journalistic boots on the ground on both sides, to not just to, of course, understand the country properly, but also to normalize the country for readers at home. And for this also, journalists have to be journalists have to stop seeing themselves and the governments of the countries to which they belong also have to stop seeing them as their instruments or their weapons. And what I'm essentially saying is that we have to be free to cover things as they are. And we are not catering to a particular ideology or a particular nationalism, but we have to be free to perform our to carry out our responsibilities as we think best. It may not agree with anybody. There may be mistakes committed, and those and every journalist who writes or who produces something knows that it's never going to be an easy run. It's never going to be mistake free. But those are professional. Those can be professionally sorted out, and I think that is what is important. I will, I don't know how much time I'll have, but I'm just going to end with, an anecdote about how socialized we are in thinking that we represent our countries when we are actually abroad. I was, in Islamabad. It was a Christmas Day lunch at Declan Walsh's place, and Declan Walsh is the New York Times correspondent. I think he had just become the New York Times correspondent, and I'm still embarrassed about this particular incident, but he said he had become the New York Times correspondent, and I said, Declan, but you aren't American. How did New York Times send you to? How's New York Times making you their correspondent in Pakistan? And everybody around the table laughed, and they said, so what if he isn't American? It's okay. He covers a news story. He doesn't have to be American to cover Pakistan for the New York Times. So it's something that I remember, and as my own socialization in the thing that when you go for a newspaper from an Indian newspaper to another country, and I've been in Sri Lanka as well before Pakistan, you actually represent your country more than journalism itself. I think we've got to get out of that mentality a bit. Yeah. So I'll end there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Nirupama, and thank you for reminding us that there should be some separation between journalism and nationalistic kind of narratives and control. We feel the same as a think tank, although we're based in the UK. We don't necessarily represent the views of the UK. Thank you so much. So I will pass over now to Salma Malik. You're muted, sorry.
Apologies. I'm in my office and several things are happening. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to see all the lovely faces once again. And for me, the basic experience, as Nirupama said, was absolutely fascinating, but also challenging because I don't usually work in this area. And I was challenged by Rabia to work on this area, one of those annual challenges. Put myself to this task, but I ended up learning a lot from the process. And thank you very much to the team BASIC for actually making me learn while I wrote. And I also realized that there were several things, the way we write, do not really come out the way they should. And I really had to understand the modalities. And it was an absolutely enjoyable as well as a painful experience. But at the end of the day, I think I ended up benefiting the most from this experience. When I started to study strategic studies, the Cuban Missile Crisis was always presented to us as a very successful model of conflict mitigation, and how World War III was thwarted, and how the world lived another day. It could have ended with a nuclear weapons war and all that stuff. And always, the hero of the story was Uncle Sam. It was JFK and RFK who deliberated on how to save the world and how to make the world a better place. And that was a very, very selective way of how this entire narration was done. Unfortunately, we would not really have a lot of Russian literature to work on, or any of those archival materials that one could think of. And at that time, we're not even really interested in deeper studies. But that is how most of the people, when they're looking at a lot of such narratives, are sort of wedded to. And much later, in fact, I must acknowledge Professor Wheeler's tutoring me into looking at alternative perspective and into looking at how this communication between the two leaders developed, and the highs and lows they went through, and all that happened. And that made me think on the highs and lows the Pakistanis and the Indians have also gone through. And it is not that it has always been a very flat-lined conflict narrative that these countries have. Speakers before me have talked about it at large as to how we have done successful stories. We have good stories. Narupama just talked about this factor that unfortunately, in all this narrative, we are actually looking at the country perspectives more than looking at the larger picture. And since we are so much wedded into this conflict narrative, then we want to make that sale pitch higher and higher. And there's a lot more demand for that particular sale pitch. It's amazing when Adil talked about the fact that the children were stranded in the chairlift yesterday, and many people in their rooms were sitting before the television screens were talking about, do we have a Chinook or we don't? Can we talk to India about this? And the major issue was, why should we talk to India about this? This is something that will put us down. This will something that will show us that we are weaker. And why would India do this? And there was another question. If this would happen in India, would Pakistan offer a Chinook if we had that? And I'm pretty sure on both sides, the questions would have been similar. And the answers would have also been very similar, that yes, we would have done that. Because we have seen this happening when the APS, the Army Public School incident happened. We have seen it happening when the earthquake happened, or when there is any natural calamity or something. The countries have come together. We have talked about positive things, but those intervals are too small and too less. And we are making this sale pitch higher and higher. And unfortunately, in today's communication modes that we have, the quick, fast-paced modes, what we are rapidly losing and lacking is that humanized touch that used to be there in the old times, in the ancient times, when we would have our correspondence across, when we would look at each other and find out that, okay, I'm a Pakistani or I'm an Indian, and this is what my country says, and this is what is supposed to be the way things are. The more the countries are trying to alienate at the public level, the higher and the deeper would be this conflict rhetoric and the conflict narrative that we find around us. Unfortunately, as Ambassador Raghavan was also talking about, that the hotline is pretty effective, but I actually would also say that it is being overpitched. It is being oversold. Has it really been that effective? Has it, in case we have more hotlines, would that really serve the purpose? Unfortunately, whenever there has been a crisis, the hotline in India and Pakistan's case, many of the times has become a casualty. And if just having the right tick mark of having a hotline is sufficient, then it is serving the purpose. But if it is also going to help mitigate the crisis, or at least do the crisis communication, if it does not help mitigate the crisis, that is not its job. Its primary job is crisis communication. If it is not even doing that effective work, n number of hotlines may not really serve the purpose. Although it is a great idea that there are as many communication linkages available to both sides as possible, so that they can use them as effectively as possible. And then I would also like the point that Ijaz had raised about the annual exchange of lists of the nuclear installations. If we look at how the world is moving today, again, many a times people would ask this question as to how effective those lists are. All you need to do is get into the Google map and you will find out so many details. Get into this, get onto the BASIC website or whatever website that we have as nuclear watchdogs, and you would have those lists. But the very fact is that even if it is not really doing the work, there is a small bit of connection, annual connection between the two countries that we are keeping, holding on to. But unfortunately, what I find, what we are doing over the years is deliberately and very effectively trying to distance and alienate ourselves even from public to public communication. And that is the worst that will happen. And we are also normalizing and communalizing, I would actually use this term, the nuclear discourse and the narrative to such a level where there's a lot of distortion, where the nuclear weapon is taken as a punish for everything, every problem that Pakistan or India have with one another. And again, the rhetoric and the sale pitch for conflict is becoming extremely loud. And it will become louder and louder as the time goes. And this is something which is extremely troublesome for both the countries, because that is absolutely a killer when it comes to nuclear responsibilities. If India and Pakistan, and that is not the fact that India and Pakistan cannot act responsible, we have acted responsible. When the composite dialogue process was initiated, one of the most successful tracks amongst the 7 tracks that there was the nuclear and strategic arms control discussion. And if the same Indians and Pakistanis could show so much of responsibility then, what is happening to us now, when we need to be more responsible, when we need to, especially when there's a plethora of weapons and so many things that are coming in, new technology which is making things more dangerous, which is lowering the thresholds. So unless and until there is an effective communication linkage at all levels, at the track 2, which is now the new track 1, where again there is a lot of animosity and a lot of bravado shown whenever both sides meet, this is going to become more and more difficult. And I must compliment BASIC for the fact that when we went there was a very open conversation. It was one of those rare moments when the South Asians, the Indians and the Pakistanis met, and there was a lot of laughter. There was a lot of friends who came together, and we were talking about any and every issue under the table. And we were even laughing at our countries and saying whatever mistakes and whatever issues that we make. And there's so many similar reactions to the issues that we have created for ourselves. But in case we really want to make the future world possible for the future generations, I think the need for having a communication channel, a very viable, healthy, strong communication channel, which is free of any type of misconceptions and stereotypes, is extremely important. The point that I had raised about having a nuclear risk reduction center, this is a debate, the point that Adil raised about how to go about it is something that has always marred this particular proposal or the notion. But the very fact is that there are a lot of dissimilarities and a lot of similarities between both sides. All we need to do is talk about the issues which are of common concern to each other, and that is going to be at least the starting point, or at least a working point for such risk reduction centers. This may be an expanded communication link or whatever. So this is my last point that I'm saying. And again, I would re-insist on the point that as both the countries move further on with their nuclear doctrines, declared or undeclared, about new technologies, about lowering the threshold, unless and until the communication linkage becomes stronger, it is going to become far more difficult, and we really need to lower the sale pitch, especially when it comes to the track 2 or the other public diplomacy fora. Thank you very much, Alice, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Salma, and thank you for emphasising the importance of the track 2. And I'm glad you enjoyed our dialogue. We certainly enjoyed it too, even if you didn't enjoy the editing process that followed. So I'll pass over now to our final author, Kamal. Over to you.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you, everyone. It's I think it's easier to follow, a lot of very insightful comments that have already been made. So I'll be very quick. First of all, I would like to, thank BASIC, and I think to see this as a culmination of, the project which we've been working together with is great, and because I have had the opportunity to also be one of the facilitators for some of the conversations we've had in this regard in India as well. And the project between BASIC, IPCS, and other partners, I think has really evolved beautifully over the last, I think, almost couple of years. And many of the discussions that I think we are having today are also a culmination of that. For instance, back in 2021, we had I think 4 national level meetings that we had organized as between BASIC and in collaboration with BASIC and ICCS to understand the nuclear responsibilities approach from an Indian perspective. And there were various security and foreign policy experts from across the country who reflected on what nuclear responsibilities mean and to whom they are owed. And there were, of course, different ways and perspectives on that. And of course, I also had the opportunity to participate in the international dialogues, both in Dubai and in Bangkok. And the Bangkok one, of course, was led to the current compendium. So it has been an absolute pleasure to work on this, first of all. I wanted to put it out there first before I got into my comments. So very quickly, I just want to talk about 2-3 sort of key arguments that I try to make in my piece. One is the fact that there is a need for reading each other right. And I know it's almost an obvious thing, but I think it's worth restating and re-arguing because I don't see it being done in the way I think it should be. I come from, in my almost like a previous life, from a science background before I came into an international relations discipline. And in science, we have what we call necessary and sufficient conditions. Reading each other right is not a sufficient condition, but it is a necessary condition. And therefore, its importance is even more probably than some of the other things that we might discuss. Because especially given the high stakes geopolitical environment between countries like adversarial, between countries, which are adversarial in nature, it is extremely important that there is an accurate understanding of each other. And this is, of course, not to in any way disregard the wealth of expertise that already exists. But the only argument, the limited argument that I try to make is that these discourses rely on statist and militarized conceptions of security. And there is a need to go beyond the military lens. So, for example, what does it mean? I think if we take an approach like that and we allow for area studies that is more holistic, I think we will have, for example, understanding being preferred over demonizing in terms of the narratives. We will also have a sort of an avoiding of looking each other and each other's voices as monoliths. So we will start to recognize that there are diversity of voices in each country, and they might be worth engaging with. I think this is the kind of critical point that I try and drive home in my article. And so what I'm trying to look at is, of course, not just a state responsibility, but also a 2-level responsibility. So it's not just the state that can take up this responsibility, but also actors outside the state, be it scholars, be it universities, think tanks, media, and of course we've had an extensive discussion about media. But this is the 2-level sort of responsibility that I talk about. Now, it is grounded in if we have to talk about the conceptual frameworks, I think it is grounded in Ralph White's concept of realistic empathy. It is also grounded, importantly, from an Indian perspective, in the ancient Indian debating tradition of Purva Paksha, which basically argues for, first of all, putting and reproducing the other side's perspective as it is in terms that are agreeable to the source of such a perspective, and then engaging with it. So this, I think, is important, and I feel, and I've sort of tried to point to certain evidence and certain trends in my article, where I try to show that that is not the case. And I think Ambassador Raghavan also touched upon this, is the power of pre-existing narratives. I think that is extremely important, and I think that also directly engages with my article, because in order to create an enabling environment, we have to look at the need for stepping away from some of these pre-existing narratives, and not approach the relationship with a preset mindset, because the evidence is there, and it's contrary to sometimes, in many times, to some of these preset narratives. So be it narratives on the current government in India, that go around in Pakistan, or let's say the tendency sometimes in India to look at the military in Pakistan as having radically different policy than the civilian governments. So I think there has to be a more nuanced approach to on both sides, be it at the state level and at the media level. And that is really what I wanted to argue for. Of course, there are several other points, and we can unpack this, but I just wanted to be very brief in this. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kamal, and thank you to all of our authors for speaking there. We're now we've got about 25 minutes for Q&A before I pass over to Professor Nick Wheeler for our closing remarks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask two questions, I think, first to the four authors, and then if the two discussants earlier want to comment as well, then they absolutely can. And I am using my privilege as the chair to kind of group and slightly edit these questions so that they're focused on crisis communications. So the first that I'm going to ask is, and I'm asking this partly because this issue did actually come up in our dialogue as well. The first question is, what are some viable low-hanging fruit we could reasonably harness to foster practical engagement to tackle other softer issues that also present crises for both sides, such as food security, climate, etc., as a low-risk way to nurture more systematic modes of crisis communication and engagement? So that's one question. I'll ask Mary if you can just copy that and paste that one into the chat so the speakers can reread that. And then the other question that I'm going to ask, which has kind of been asked a couple of times in some of the questions, are around lessons learnt, both from historical crises, but also what practices we could either take from those or from the discussions we've had and apply to new. So there were two questions. The first, are there any lessons to be learned in terms of responsible crisis management from India and Pakistan, which can be applied to current and future nuclear crises? And also the question, amid changing geostrategic environment and shifting, if a crisis erupts between India and Pakistan, like the 2019 Pulwama crisis, what sort of responsible actions can and should be taken by both? So I'm merging both of those questions to say, ask that final question, what sort of responsible actions can and should be taken by both sides? Now, the authors, of course, have already answered some of these questions in their compendium pieces. So I would once again encourage you to go away, download it and read it for some of these answers. So if any of the authors do choose to answer that question, can I ask that you maybe just pick one and thinking in the short term, one thing that that both sides could implement that would be helpful in those situations. So the questions are going to come back in the chat. Do I have a volunteer from any of the authors to go first in trying to tackle those questions, or do I have to pick on someone? Sounds like I have to pick on someone. Kamal, why don't I start with you, if that's okay, if you have anything to comment on those two questions?
So I think the one on low-hanging fruits, and that's the one, right? Yeah. Okay. So no, I think so. And I actually mentioned some of this in my piece as well, which has been pointed out here, which is I do agree. Like food security, especially in the current geopolitical situation globally, is a matter of concern, not just for India and Pakistan, but also the entire global South. again, then that's sort of an immediate issue. And climate change being the other, which is slightly more. It is an immediate issue, but probably the impact of it is felt in sporadically sometimes. But both issues, I do agree, are issues where there is almost near convergence between the two countries. So I think there are, and at the same time, a subset of the climate issue is also the disaster management. And I think both countries have faced extreme weather conditions, very problematic disaster patterns. And I do think that those are areas of convergence. But I think, again, it kind of goes back to creating the enabling environment for such things to happen. Because even in the last, I think, just 8-9 years, there have been some instances of such cooperation, no matter how small they are. So from my perspective, I think the enabling environment, again, has to be there. The basic foundation has to be there. Unless there is that basic enabling environment, even the low-hanging fruits can become, difficult, I think.
Thank you, Kamal. Would anybody like to volunteer next?
Yeah, sure, if I
you,
may.
Jess.
So here's the thing. Adversity can either create opportunities for cooperation or actually escalate conflicts. It entirely depends on what the context is. Now, for instance, if water becomes scarce, how will the upper riparian actually behave? Is the upper riparian going to have some kind of empathy towards the lower riparian or not? Or because it's a resource that's getting scarce. So it entirely depends whether this kind of adversity. Now, obviously, once again, it's a complete no-brainer to say that climate is something which obviously requires regional cooperation. And if I remember, I think Kamal will also remember, this was a point that came up during the conference, and I actually mentioned it as one of the areas where perhaps there could be cooperative strategies, and then we could perhaps extrapolate from those cooperative strategies and bring in other things also, namely food security and the rest of it. And I think it makes eminent sense, for instance, in the Punjab border on both sides, in terms of wheat and vegetables and the rest of it, instead of Pakistan getting it from Iran and then bringing it to Punjab, which is obviously, I mean, for Balochistan, it's easier to get it from Iran or Afghanistan, but for Punjab, it's much easier to get it from Indian Punjab, and ditto for various other things. But as Kamal said, there has to be some kind of enabling environment. And let me here refer to this fabulous documentary that Errol Morris did on Robert Strange McNamara. It's called it's called The Fog of War: 11 Lessons from the Life of Robert Strange McNamara. And the first lesson is with reference to, I think it's interesting because Salma also mentioned it, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The first lesson is empathize with the enemy. And so should JFK respond to the hard letter by Khrushchev or the soft letter? And so there are a number of issues in terms of how you develop that kind of empathy. Unfortunately, what we have seen so far is that not only that empathy is nearly zero now, but we have also seen, and this is a point that most Pakistanis who watch India would make, we've seen this tendency, at least in the current political setup of India, of using certain kind of crises for domestic political reasons. And so when you bring that into the equation, then unfortunately, that does not leave much room for cooperative strategies. Having said that, the wish assumption is that yes. And by the way, that has happened previously during Musharraf's period. That has happened. There were lots of these visits, and the dyadic trade, border trade, it makes eminent sense. But whether we have the enabling environment for that is moot.
Thank you, Ijaz. Salma, can I ask if you're happy to come in on that question?
To your question about another nuclear incident, I would say that, first of all, both the countries need to realize that they may be weapons of political currency, but they cannot really overuse these terminologies and overuse the efficacy of not using the nuclear weapon or using deterrence as a weapon to really scare each other and to sell it as a political vote-gaining gimmick. I mean, Pulwama, whether it was done by India or it would have been done by Pakistan, is a great eye-opener for both sides to realize that the slip down this slope is very fast. And anything can happen and anything would have happened. So we need to really avoid these things. We need to actually start acting responsibly and not use the N-word, actually just for vote gaining or overemphasizing on crises. And the need is to actually initiate a crisis communication and use these already available channels, especially at such a time of crisis. Unfortunately, whenever we have a crisis, again, the word that I have used previously as well, our sale pitch for war and the rhetoric against one another becomes so high that no one really wants to hear to any voice of sanity. So the first word should be restraint, and then responsible communication. So this is my answer to your second question. And I think both food security as well as climate change are issues of concern. In fact, any of these problems, the COVID provided both the countries with an immense opportunity to actually get into a cooperation mode with one another, and also to reinitiate SARC as a viable regional body. But let's not go there. But still, the point is that could have been a great enabler, especially in the health sector, where India is doing a lot when it comes to the medicines and so many other things. But unfortunately, what we have decided is that we have decided to totally disagree with each other and totally not cooperate with each other. And this is really going to become very difficult for both countries in the coming years. Because this differential may there be in the economic realm, but we are really not going away from each other physically. So we are stuck with one another. And unless and until we get into a cooperative mode and realize that there are certain challenges which no physical barriers, food insecurity, climate change, especially climate change, is a very, very important grid where there can be enormous opportunities for cooperation. And we have to slow down on our physical conflict as well, because that is another precursor to fast-paced climate change that we really have to retard and control right now before things become too difficult. Thank you.
Thank you, Salma. Ambassador, I can see that you have your hand up. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, the India-Pakistan relationship right now is at such a low plateau that there are numerous low-hanging fruits available. You could begin by having high commissioners and stationed in both countries. You could add to that by even a small opening in trade will make a big difference. So there are any number of easily doable things, but on the whole, the India-Pakistan relationship is driven by numerous factors. But what is often underrated is that it is also driven by sentiment, and it is driven by political initiative. And I think we should never underestimate the power of political initiative. Because when you look at the diplomatic history of India and Pakistan, things happen all of a sudden, which nobody expected or could have anticipated. Now, even if you look at the post-August 2019 period, the India-Pakistan terrain shows surprising contrarian developments. In November 2019, soon after the legislative changes with regard to J&K, you have the opening of the Kartarpur Sahib visa-free corridor, something which could not be done when India-Pakistan relations were going quite well in the first decade of the 20th century, was achieved at the worst possible period of India-Pakistan relations. Similarly, you have a reaffirmation of the ceasefire, again at a very low point in India-Pakistan relations. So my point is that one should not let the negatives and the general overall adversarial nature of the relationship drown out the possibility of positives. And these are important positives, and there are many more which are possible. One surprising example, which I think is often overlooked, and while we do talk about the Indus Waters Treaty as a good system, which may be facing slight problems now, but on the whole, a good achievement in how to manage a contentious issue of upper and lower riparian states. Another very interesting example which has managed to continue notwithstanding conflicts, wars, and so on, is cooperation between India and Pakistan and also Iran in dealing with locusts. Now, this is so small scale that it falls below everyone's radar. But this is a program which has run continuously since the late 1960s. Without a pause. It's a surprising thing to witness in the India-Pakistan context. I just thought I'll make these remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Sultan, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thank you. A question was raised, and we had been talking about the communication during crisis or after crisis, or the lesson learned. What I see once we looking at this issue from a communication perspective, where we are in a state of perpetual crisis because we don't talk to each other on nuclear issues. We try not to understand each other's signaling also, and various positions or postures. I think once we're talking about communication to reduce the nuclear dangers, in that context, I'm saying we are in a perpetual crisis. We have so many interpretations of our own of each other's positions. So that was one point. The second, several colleagues have mentioned about the low-hanging fruit. I think it's not about the low-hanging fruit. It's about something which is in your face, the climate security that was talked about. I'll just give you a reference. One of my students recently completed his dissertation. And the impact of military preparedness because of the climate. Siachen glaciers, they are melting. Both countries, they spend enormous amount to maintain their troops over Siachen, and both are going to be affected. And likewise, sea rise, so naval capability and the air capability also. There was also another study by Carnegie in which Jamie talked about how it is going to affect nuclear deterrent of United States, the sea rise or the floods and these silos that are in the those areas which are flood prone. I think these are some of the issues that are in our face, and we are not talking about these things, and these are going to affect both India and Pakistan. I think that's why I thought I need to emphasize that we should not be talking about climate security as just because it's in vogue these days. Everybody talks about it. These are real existential challenges for both India and Pakistan, and we will have to talk to each other on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ijaz, I see you have a hand up, but I'm afraid we only have 5 minutes left for questions. So I'm just going to ask one final question, which is quite specific. The audience member says, I'm glad you reminded, this is to the ambassador, the audience about the utility of the DGMO's hotlines. That said, it is important to reassess its efficacy, given that the fog of war and crises is becoming thicker. So what specifically are your suggestions to make the hotline more effective and responsive to current sets of crisis triggers? that question, Adil, you may also want to come in on that question, but we only got 5 minutes. So Ambassador, if you would like to quickly respond to that question. Sorry, you're muted.
Thank you for the question. Well, I think one should see the hotlines such as they are in a wider context. Clearly, it is better to have a hotline than not have one. But to expect it to move mountains would be unrealistic. To my mind, in the India-Pakistan context, baby steps should not be ever downplayed or not given enough importance. So the hotlines, as I had said, are primarily, the present DGMO's hotline is primarily a army hotline, and it is focused excessively or exclusively to some extent on the line of control. To some extent, it does act as a confidence-building measure and ensures that there is a greater understanding of each other's position, which is then passed on down to the forces on the ground. I think that having more hotlines, especially between the navies, given the expanding footprint of both in the Arabian Sea, as also between the air forces, would be a good development. It does not resolve all the larger issues about how effective can be a DGMO's hotline or a military-to-military hotline, given the overall political nature of the divisions which exist. I think those issues will remain, and those can only be addressed by what was referred to as being the overall environment, which requires certainly much more robust diplomacy on both sides. But hotlines as a containment measure, as a stabilization measure, definitely are important.
Thank you. Dr. Sultan, would you like to weigh in at all?
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of political will. If there's political will, even one hotline would be sufficient. But since both sides are reluctant to engage on issues which are substantial, and especially during crisis, you can have as many hotlines as you want, but if they're not willing to talk to each other, so they are not going to work. So it's a matter of political will. But just on the lighter side, do we really need hotlines in this age of hypermedia? To state an example, the cruise missile incident, probably both sides decision maker, they came to know from the media that something has fallen, and then everybody started looking at. Of course, being from the Air Force, I have talked to my colleagues that they did track something, because this was unexpected, but they did track something, a projectile coming, but they were not conclusive about what was it, unless the media showed the wreckage of that missile on a Pakistani soil, and then people started to scramble both sides, and then the Indians also came to know something has gone from their side. That was on the lighter side, but there could be several means of communication, and these are all effective, and you need to talk even if you are adversaries, especially once you are nuclear weapon states.
If I can just add, there was a reference to the Foreign Office hotlines and how it fell into disuse. Well, in the good days, it never fell into disuse, but it was just thought that WhatsApp is a better and more effective way of communicating. So hotlines, there's a certain mystique about it, but the idea is to have a greater sense of ease with each other so that you can communicate quickly and very frankly with the opposite party.
Thank you both for your answers to that. I think your point about WhatsApp is really interesting, and there's lots of work going on now around having secure and resilient forms of crisis communication mechanisms, but we didn't get to any of those questions around multilateral mechanisms and things like that. Unfortunately, we have run out of time to answer any more questions. I think the fact that there are so many unanswered questions really points to how valuable these discussions are, and the fact that we really need more of them and more of this intellectual negotiation happening both on paper and in forums like this. So thank you all to the authors for speaking, to the discussants for speaking, and for all of you there for participating through the form of asking questions. I'd now like to pass over to Professor Nicholas Wheeler for closing remarks. Nick, the floor is yours. You've got 10 minutes.
Thanks, Alice. Hello, everybody. I think we've had a great discussion, and it's a pleasure for me to offer some brief closing remarks and some thanks. So I've divided my brief comments into two parts. First, I want to say something about the relationship between trust and CBMs. And second, I want to say something about the use of crisis communication mechanisms during crisis situations. In their essays, Ijaz Haider and Dr. Salma Malik highlight how there is an urgent need for new CSBMs to be established that can reduce the risks of inadvertent escalation in times of crisis. But as they both appreciate, there's little prospect of establishing these in the absence of a new trusting relationship between the two states. And this highlights the key paradox of CBMs. They're often identified as mechanisms to promote trust in adversarial relations. But there's little or no evidence to support this in the India-Pakistan context. Instead, the historical record suggests that breakthroughs in the development of major CBMs has depended on the prior existence of trust between Indian and Pakistani leaders. I give one brief example. If you think about the nuclear CBMs agreed in the 1999 Lahore Declaration, which of course continue to this day, they only became possible, I would argue, because of the interpersonal trust that developed between Prime Ministers Nawaz Sharif of Pakistan and his Indian counterpart, Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Trust of this kind is also key to India and Pakistan using crisis communication mechanisms more effectively in the future. Now, the introduction and the essays in the compendium make two key points about the existing usage of these mechanisms, and we've talked about this a lot today. First, Indian and Pakistani decision makers have either suspended use of these channels at key moments in a crisis, or they've been less than forthcoming in the information they've provided. And second, one or both sides simply refuse to use the formal channels during a crisis. The first problem of channels not being effectively used when they're most needed is well illustrated by the 1986-87 brass tacks crisis. The problem that India and Pakistan faced in the brass tacks crisis was that as both sides mobilized for war, there was uncertainty as to whether information exchanged in the DGMO channel that we were just talking about could be trusted. But just at the moment when trustworthy communication was most urgently needed on both sides. The second problem of one or both sides not using the existing machinery was evident in India's response to what it later claimed was an accidental launch of its BrahMos missile in March 22. As discussed in the compendium, and again in the discussion here, it appears that there was no attempt by Indian officials or policymakers in the hours after the accidental launch was known to inform Pakistan through the use of the formal channels or indeed other back channels. Even if leaders are willing to utilize the formal channels to signal reassurance, how do they distinguish credible signals of each other's intent from the proliferation of information, especially in a context where, as the essays point out in the compendium, nuclear jingoism and enemy imaging can be rife in social and print media communications? The answer is that what is required, as Dr. Malik also points out in her essay and contribution, is a secure, trustworthy channel of communication between Indian and Pakistani leaders, where each believes that the signals sent in that channel are trustworthy ones. Yet all the essays in the collection highlight the barrier to developing trust of this kind, posed by enemy imaging and the urgent need to find ways of presenting the adversary in a better and more positive light to overcome that enemy imaging, which is such a barrier to the development of trust. And to try to challenge the mutual identity blaming that drives the conflict. As Dr. Akhtar and Ruhi Neog highlight in their jointly written conclusion, a notable example, as Alice said, of India-Pakistan cooperation and cross-border scholarly collaboration. This compendium, and indeed more generally the BASIC-ICCS Nuclear Responsibilities Programme, seeks to contribute to this objective of decommissioning the enemy images that drive this mutual identity blaming. Ambassador Raghavan drew attention importantly to the lack of strategic empathy in the relationship. Kamal emphasized the importance of mobilizing Ralph White's idea of realistic empathy, and Ijaz, in his remarks in the Q&A, drew attention to just how difficult it is to exercise this form of empathy. In thinking about how to promote greater empathy in the relationship, the concept of security dilemma sensibility that we've used on the Nuclear Responsibilities Programme, developed by Ken Booth and I in our 2000 book, The Security Dilemma, may be helpful. Security dilemma sensibility is predicated on the intention and capacity to understand how one's own actions have generated fear in the other. And it calls for a responsiveness that seeks to signal reassurance to an adversary. Exploring the potential for exercising security dilemma sensibility should be a shared responsibility of India and Pakistan. And critical to this, as the essays by Niruparma and Carmel recognize, is the importance of Indian and Pakistani decision makers seeing themselves through the eyes of the other. This is the key to cultivating empathy in the relationship and breaking down the image fixation that both Ambassador Raghavan and Dr. Sultan highlighted as a key barrier to effective communication. There have been important episodes of interpersonal trust in the India-Pakistan relationship, but this has never been sustained or the trust passed on to their successors. In the end, the challenge remains one of embedding trust, not only in the decision-making process and bureaucratic structures of the state, but crucially in the two societies at the people-to-people level. Let me close with a general reflection on India-Pakistan nuclear crisis interactions. I share Dr. Sultan's view that it's important to not impose a Cold War template on India-Pakistan nuclear interactions. But I think there is one Cold War idea that does importantly carry over. This is the concept of an adversary partnership, a term famously coined by Marshall Schulman. Competition existed during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And Salma drew attention, of course, to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it had to be conducted cautiously, given the shadow of nuclear destruction. India and Pakistan share a similar fate of being adversary partners. And as with superpower crises in the Cold War, the cooperative element of avoiding nuclear disaster has come to the fore in times of crisis. But can this be relied upon indefinitely? And this is why there is such a premium on developing new mechanisms and practices of crisis prevention. In the context of his efforts to strengthen the League of Nations as the storm clouds gathered over Europe in the mid-1930s, the Professor of International Relations, Sir Alfred Zimmern, called for a transformation of power politics into what he called responsibility politics. Responsible crisis communication is an integral part of this form of politics. And the editors and authors hope that the compendium we've launched today makes a modest contribution to promoting this form of politics. Finally, let me offer some thanks by way of closing the webinar. First, I'd like to thank on behalf of all the BASIC-ICCS team, Rabia and the CSSPR team for all your support in the work that we do together. Ruhi and the IPCS team for all the work that we do together. And the authors of the compendium for your excellent contributions, and particularly Mari and Munir, who have facilitated the organization of this webinar so excellently. I'd also like to thank Alice for her excellent moderation of the event. And finally, thank you to all of you for joining us for the launch of this compendium and for your challenging and engaging questions. Thank you.